Avatar is undoubtedly one of my favorite cartoons of all time. I love everything from its world building to its mythology, art style, choreography, and especially its characters. The way they change and develop over the course of the series makes for some of the best moments in the show overall, I feel. As you can read in the title, that's what we're going to be focusing on this time around. Now, if you haven't seen Avatar and don't understand why people love it so much, then pause this video, go watch the show, and come back to this later. Please, trust me, you'll be doing yourself a favor. I'm not even just saying that because of spoilers, even though there are definitely some big ones coming up. I believe these moments are powerful, but they only work if you understand the full context of each one and how the story has built up to them. I'll do my best to recap the scenarios of each entry in order to explain why I feel they're so emotionally powerful, but my words can only do so much. I truly believe you need to experience this show firsthand for yourself. If you are not a veteran of the series, I worry you won't fully understand why these moments are as strong as they are. You owe it to yourself to watch Avatar and experience these moments naturally, rather than just taking my word for it. Like I said, I'll give a little bit of a recap of the situation in which each moment takes place, but I'm only doing that as a little refresher since it has been a while since Avatar ended. And just so there's no confusion, these are all moments from The Last Airbender, not Legend of Korra. Will I do a separate list for Korra? Maybe, we'll see. But my point that I'm really trying to drive home here is that I'm making this list under the assumption that you have already seen the show and will recognize most, if not all, of the moments presented here. I don't want this to be uncharted territory for anyone. There are a lot more than just 10 moments in the show that were memorable, but I'd be here all day if I listed them all. So just because you don't see a certain scene here doesn't mean I didn't like it or that I didn't feel it left an emotional impact. I'm just picking out the ones that I personally feel were the absolute best. And for the sake of avoiding copyright issues with Viacom, I'll be using screenshots from the show instead of actual footage. It's not my preference to do it this way, but it's pretty much the only way you'll be able to watch this video at all. With all of that said, let the countdown begin. Make sure you have a tissue box nearby, because we're going on a feels trip. We're your family now, the Southern Air Temple. Having just started their journey together, Aang, Katara, and Sokka make their first stop at the Southern Air Temple, Aang's old home. And while Aang himself is excited to be back, Katara and Sokka are a little uneasy about all of this, and it doesn't take long for us to figure out why. It isn't until much later in the episode that the full gravity of Aang's situation finally sinks in. He uncovers the skeletal remains of his beloved mentor, Monkey Atso. Overcome with unbridled emotions, Aang enters the Avatar state, but it's Katara's words that bring him back. It's not possible to pin down what exactly triggered the Avatar state in this moment, but I believe that's because it was so much more than just one distinct feeling. Aang feels immense anger towards the Fire Nation for murdering his people, self-detrimental guilt for abandoning his old life and responsibilities, grief and loneliness for realizing that he really is the last of his kind. All of this, and probably more, were swirling together into unimaginable rage, deprived of thought or reason. But Katara is there to bring Aang back. She reaches out to him and helps him find comfort in the company of her and Sokka. Aang probably trusted no one at all at that moment, maybe not even himself for running away. But Katara took the chance and reminded Aang that she was someone he could trust. It's true that the Airbenders are gone, but that doesn't mean that Aang's all alone. He did make a mistake and will have to do a lot over the course of the series to make up for it. But it was pivotal that Aang first found a place to call home. And that place was with his friends. And to think that the three of them had just met, and they hadn't spent that much time together at this point in the series. So the fact that Katara and Sokka were there for Aang for his entire journey, and their words were true, only makes this moment even more important than we probably first realized. Hopefull Again, the Serpent's Pass. While making their way to Ba Sing Se, Team Avatar meets up with Suki and a group of refugees, one of whom is a pregnant woman. They agree to escort the refugees through the deadly Serpent's Pass, but it isn't just the dangerous territory that makes this trip difficult. Sokka has conflicting feelings about seeing Suki again after losing Princess Yue, and Aang is struggling to contain his frustration over losing Appa to the Sandbenders back in the desert. The group doesn't quite make it to the city before the woman's baby has to be delivered. But the worst of it was already behind them, and they all managed to make it across the Serpent's Pass alive. Because of this, the woman decides to name her baby Hope. But this moment isn't just significant because the baby's name suggests that the refugee family's future will be brighter in Ba Sing Se, but also because it inspires optimism in Aang, something he was in desperate need of having at that point, even though he didn't realize it yet. Like the Southern Air Temple, Appa was one of Aang's last connections to his old life. Having lost his faithful companion and having to grapple with the uncertainty of whether or not he would ever see him again was heart-wrenching for him, to say the least. But over the course of the previous episode and this one, Team Avatar kind of realizes just how much more difficult their journey was going to be without having Appa as a convenient means of transportation. They never took Appa for granted, but without him, Aang's journey to master the four elements as he traveled the world was going to be more difficult than they ever imagined. Just that thought alone probably made Aang feel even more pessimistic about the future. But it's just as he explained to Katara. Seeing that family together, so full of happiness and love, it reminded Aang that although their situation seemed bleak, it was still okay, and important in fact, for him to remain hopeful. He still had his friends, Katara especially, and that helped Aang realize that there was still time to find Appa and get their mission back on track. Out of all the characters on the show, Aang was always one of the more consistently cheerful and optimistic ones. Not just because he was a kid, but also because of how the monks raised him. Not to mention his desire to be a positive influence on the world as the Avatar. After losing Appa, Aang went to a pretty dark place for a while, but the old Aang that we knew and loved came back. The title of this entry kind of has a double meaning when you think about it. It was literally the birth of a baby girl named Hope, but it was also the birth of hope for a brighter future for Team Avatar. Aang and Appa reunite. Lake Laogai. The previous entry and this one kind of go hand in hand. While the birth of hope could be viewed as a new beginning, this moment was a subsequent ending, and a satisfying one at that. After working so hard to reach Ba Sing Se and coming so close to exposing Long Feng's dark secret, in addition to tracking down Appa, Aang and his friends find themselves cornered by the Dai Li. And just when things look bad, Appa emerges from the sunlight in the distance and comes to their rescue. This was the moment fans had waited 7 episodes for. We knew Appa was alive and was out searching for Aang. We saw how close the gang was to finding out what happened to him and where he was. Now it was just a matter of hoping their paths would finally cross. They did, and the reunion was every bit as satisfying as we were hoping it would be. Aang's suffering was over, and his hope and endurance were rewarded with the return of his lifelong friend. There isn't much dialogue to reference when interpreting how the characters were feeling at that moment, but there didn't need to be. We could see it for ourselves. What Aang felt when seeing that family together with their new daughter, and all of their happiness and love, that's what we saw Aang and his friends feeling with Appa right then and there. And even though the stakes only continued to rise in the last few episodes of Book 2, this moment was a victory, one that the group desperately needed, and one they cherished. If Only I Could Have Helped You, The Tales of Ba Sing Se. The Tales of Ba Sing Se was an interesting chapter. If Avatar truly was an anime, this particular episode would probably come pretty close to being classified as filler, since in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't do a whole lot to forward the overall plot. That's not to say that it wasn't entertaining or worth watching though. The stories of each character and their adventures in the city served as a nice break from the action and heavier conflicts that were still going on at the time. And they did offer slight character development for everyone, and that's always a plus in my book. So where does the emotional moment come in, you might ask? Well, let's turn our attention to the tale of Iroh. Through Iroh's story, we see him helping all kinds of people throughout the city as he goes about his day. He plays with some children, sings to a crying child, and helps steer a mugger back on the right path in his life. We get a good depiction that Iroh is a wise and generous soul who takes pleasure in spreading goodwill to others, despite his past as a Fire Nation general. But there's a deeper meaning to all of it, and we see that at the end of his story. Iroh unpacks his supplies on a hill far away from the city streets. He pulls out 2 incenses, lights them, and places them near a photograph as he begins to sing Leaves from the Vine, a song that he knows all too well in memory of someone very special to him. Today is the birthday of Iroh's late son, Lu Ten, who died during the siege of Ba Sing Se. But it's what Iroh says that continues to break my heart every time I watch this scene. Happy birthday, my son. If only I could have helped you. It also doesn't help that this was the last scene recorded by Iroh's former voice actor, Mako, before he passed away. The pasts of Aang and Zuko. The Storm. While the Southern Air Temple helped Aang accept that he really was the last Airbender, this episode forces Aang to come to grips with being the Avatar, as well as the fact that he disappeared for 100 years when the world needed him the most. He gets called out for his mistake by a grumpy old fisherman and runs off to a cave in shame just as a storm is about to hit. At the same time, Zuko's leadership is called into question by one of his crew members, which prompts Iroh to step in and explain the hardships of his nephew's life. This was probably one of the most important episodes of the entire series because it gives us a full look at why exactly Aang ran away and why Zuko is so obsessed with chasing the Avatar. We learn that Aang was afraid of the responsibility of being the Avatar as a young child and was upset that the monks were trying to separate him from Monkey Atso, who meant well and just wanted Aang to still have the time to enjoy his childhood. Meanwhile, Zuko spoke out against one of his father's plans during a war meeting, and because of that, he was forced to duel against him in an Agni Kai. This is where Zuko's scar on his face came from. After refusing to fight, Zuko was banished from the Fire Nation and forced to pursue the Avatar under the notion that this was the only way he could regain his honor after what he had done. For both of these characters, their circumstances were harsh and, in some respects, unjustified. There was no particular moment within this episode that stands out for this entry, but rather just the entire history and sequence of events. Watching Aang and Zuko suffer emotionally and physically is just depressing, especially when you remember that they were young and naive when this stuff happened to them. Also, the stormy weather sets the mood for this episode perfectly. It ends with both characters coming to grips with what happened to them and accepting the people they are now. And symbolically, that's when the storm subsides. Motherly Katara, the Runaway. In this episode, Toph uses her blindness to scam people in a nearby town out of their money. Katara disapproves of this behavior, believing that it can only lead to trouble. The tension between her and Toph only continues to escalate out of control until the two girls stop speaking to each other entirely. Sokka pulls Toph aside to talk to her about Katara and tries to make her understand something. At first, it just sounds like they're both about to talk badly about her behind her back, even though Katara's in the water at the bottom of the cliff they're sitting atop and she can hear every word they're saying. But then Sokka reveals something he'd never really admitted to anyone. He talks about the pain he felt when he and Katara lost their mother, and praises her for stepping up to assume that caring motherly role when there was no one else who could. But it's what Sokka says right after that always kills me inside. Sokka can't remember what his own mother looked like because Katara has been there taking care of him for so long. The praise he sings for his sister is simply beautiful. This isn't just a case of siblings loving each other just because they're family. Sokka has grown to depend and rely on Katara because she filled the void for him that was left by his mother, and Katara has become so important to Sokka that she's even beginning to replace the memory of who his real mother was. And the scene doesn't even depict this as a depressing reality like it might sound. Despite all of the arguing Sokka might do with Katara, it's revealed in this moment that he deeply appreciates her and thinks so highly of her where it matters most. Sokka's revelation moves Toph into admitting her own praise for Katara's kindness and understanding of her true character. And even though neither Sokka nor Toph ever realize it, Katara hears every word of these revelations. The arc of Katara's vengeance. The Southern Raiders. The Avatar series has depicted Katara as a caring, brave, loyal, and loving character. But this episode explores a side of her we've never seen before. Zuko has just joined Team Avatar, and although he has managed to win over Aang and Sokka in the previous episodes, Katara still doesn't trust him. and rightfully so given the history these two characters have had with each other. But the Southern Raiders is the episode that changes all of that. Zuko remembers Katara revealing to him when they were imprisoned together in Ba Sing Se that the Fire Nation killed her mother, so he reaches out to Sokka to learn more about what happened that day. He identifies the murderer as a member of the Southern Raiders, and offers to Katara the chance to confront the man who did it. This awakens a much darker side to Katara that we've never seen before, and it's honestly pretty terrifying to see her so consumed with hatred, even if we do understand where it's coming from. I'm putting Katara's entire character arc in this episode for this entry instead of one particular moment because I feel the overall progression from start to finish was a lot more emotionally satisfying to watch than just one scene or segment of it. When Katara is first given the proposal by Zuko, a newfound seriousness takes over her. She lashes out at Aang and Sokka for not understanding how important this is to her, even though they're just concerned for her well-being and are afraid that she might do something she'll live to regret if she doesn't think this through. At one point, Katara even uses bloodbending on a soldier, a power that she vowed never to use again. That alone should give the audience a pretty clear indication that she's dead serious about finding this man. Zuko and Katara do eventually track down the man who killed Katara's mother. His name is Yan-Ra. He's retired and lives on Whaletail Island with his bitter old mom. Katara confronts Yan-Ra directly and comes close, so very close to actually killing him and fulfilling her vengeance. But at the moment of truth, she stops. Katara doesn't go through with it. Katara reveals that all along, she wanted to face this man simply to learn who he was and how he could do something as terrible as murder. Well, she got her answer. Yan-Ra turned out to be a pathetic, sad, and empty old man who cowers in fear of her. Katara has faced the source of her anger, her pain, her hatred. She could have killed him right there, but instead she spares his life and walks away. The old Katara that we had grown to recognize and expect, in the end, was still there inside of her, and it prevailed. Katara has almost always been a sensible, bright young woman, and in the end, that still shines through when it needed to most. Katara didn't allow vengeance to completely take over. She never lost her true self. She accepted her anger and released it. Katara could have killed Yan-Ra. I truly believe that she could. But she didn't, because deep down, she knew it wouldn't bring her any real sense of closure, or rather, any more than facing this man had already given her. This is how you tell a story of vengeance. You show how the dark and twisted thoughts of pain and revenge can corrupt a character. Watch how it begins to influence their behavior and actions, and regardless of how it ends, demonstrate that the person they have been portrayed to be up until this moment still persists within, despite the lasting impression that has been left on that character. Vengeance takes people to a primitive and horrifying state of mind, and I believe that it's much more realistic when a lasting impression is left on the character as they move on from that incident. But that shouldn't change a character to the point where they're no longer recognizable to who they were before. Learning to overcome that drastic change, I believe, is a true sign of a character's strength. Revenge is a demon that the character overcomes, but doesn't truly vanquish entirely. I think it was brilliant the way a sweet and loving girl like Katara could be brought to such a horrific place, and despite being vulnerable to it initially, still manages to persevere and overcome it. Azula's Meltdown. Sozin's Comet Part 4, Avatar Aang. Azula. She's deadly, precise, and terrifying above all else. If there were any fictional character who came close to achieving absolute perfection, I think it was her. She lived to strike fear into the hearts of anyone and everyone who opposed her, and she thrived on asserting her dominance over the weak or inferior. Azula came closer than anyone else to killing the Avatar, not just Aang, but ending the Avatar cycle itself, prior to Zahir, of course. So when one of the most prominent antagonists on the show with dangerous abilities is on the verge of becoming Fire Lord and attaining ultimate political power, that's a pretty scary combination. But the interesting thing is that this seemingly perfect combination of factors turned out to be Azula's greatest downfall. Up until Book 3, Azula was pretty much perfect. She was calm and collected, and her powers made her nearly unstoppable. So it actually seems almost fitting that Azula herself was the one who finally stopped her for good. Her best friends betrayed her, the memory of the mother she despised was haunting her, she no longer had Zuko under her thumb, and the daunting pressure of leading a country was driving Azula to her breaking point. But her descent into madness is most evident when Zuko and Katara confront her one last time on the day of Sozin's Comet. In an Agni Kai of proportions never before seen, Zuko proves himself to no longer be inferior to his sister, but equal, perhaps even having surpassed her. But despite her dirty tricks, Katara overpowers and restrains Azula at the most critical moment, and everything comes to a tragic end. Azula breaks down hysterically, wailing miserably with wild streams of fire running rampant with every frustrated breath she takes. This was a pinnacle moment for the series, right here. It was the end of Azula's reign of terror. Despite how perfect she tried to make herself seem to the world, she too had crippling flaws that led to her downfall in the end. Unlike Zuko, she was blind to the arrogance of her nation and its military. She was alone and betrayed, while her brother was surrounded by people who cared for him and understood him. Perhaps Azula finally realized at last that she had finally become the monster her mother feared so much. And undoubtedly, Azula was most likely frustrated that she had come so close to attaining ultimate power in the world, only for her reign as Fire Lord to be short-lived. The Azula that the audience had come to know, fear, and in some cases even love, was dead, even though Azula herself was forced to live with her insanity. The campfire scene. The beach. Zuko takes a trip to Ember Island with Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee. After the group has some fun, a bit of tension grows at a party, and it's the scene that unfolds immediately after that takes this entry. As the campfire burns, emotions laced with rage fly from all directions, and we receive character growth from 4 different characters at once. Despite being a couple, Mai is frustrated with Zuko's temper and overreactions to every new development. She finds him incredibly hostile and overprotective, while Zuko questions if she has any real sense of passion for him, or anything for that matter. Ty Lee gets called out for being quirky and overly cheerful in the group, but we learn that the reason she enjoys being so different and ran away to join the circus was because she was afraid of growing up and being exactly like her sisters and never having any identity of her own. She was scared of fading into obscurity without having done anything substantial with her life. She was scared of living the rest of her life as part of a matched set. But perhaps she stands out so much to the point where everyone else just finds it to be too much. Mai is pretty much the opposite. She had a very strict upbringing where she had to stay in line for the sake of her family's political reputation. Self-expression was discouraged to the point where Mai seems almost incapable of expressing any emotion at all, even though we do see it come through now in this brief moment. Meanwhile, Zuko's rage and frustration stems from his regret towards the decision he made back in Ba Sing Se. He has finally returned to the Fire Nation with his honor and his father's respect, and yet he's confused why this hasn't made him happy. Zuko is irritated over not knowing what else is wrong in his life, and he takes it out on everyone around him. We might know what Zuko was truly angry about, but at that moment, he didn't fully understand. He had to live with that suffering, so his anger is pretty much justified. He thought returning home would end the suffering he's felt from the beginning of the series up until that moment, but now that Zuko has reached what he thought he wanted, he has found that the suffering has only made him feel worse. Even Azula gives us some insight into her own history with conflict she had towards her mother. It's not as much as what we see from the others here, but it's definitely more than we've ever seen of Azula previously. Looking back, it's kind of incredible how much foreshadowing there was in this scene. And now that we know how things play out for the rest of the series after this episode, it makes this one all the more important. Zuko's anger and confusion leads him to finding his way to redemption. Azula's hint to her mother thinking of her as a monster could have been the beginning signs of Azula's downfall and transformation into a monster. And Mai and Ty Lee got their first real instances of character development up until this point in the series, and it was the last major moment we'd see of them before they turned against Azula and made their exit out of the ongoing plot until the end. So much happened at once in this one scene of this one episode, and all of it was emotional. These characters weren't born bad, life circumstances just sort of made them that way. Iroh and Zuko reconcile. Sozin's Comet Part 2, The Old Masters. Iroh and Zuko have probably one of the best relationships of any characters on this show. The two start out having such radically different personalities and viewpoints, so much so to the point where Iroh was even a comedic foil to Zuko in some instances in Book 1. But over the course of the series, the bond between Iroh and Zuko changes and grows. Iroh begins to see more of the burden his nephew faces as the banished prince, and Zuko begins to let go of his anger and pessimism to become more at peace with himself, just as Iroh is. But in the moment of truth, Zuko betrayed Iroh to side with his nation, even though deep down it wasn't what he wanted, even if Zuko hadn't realized it yet. It didn't take long for Zuko to see that he made the wrong choice, as he spends the first half of Book 3 regretting his alliance and struggling to sort through his confusion over what he truly wants for himself. But after joining Team Avatar and enlisting the help of the White Lotus to face the Fire Nation in Aang's absence, Zuko finally gets his chance to make things right with Iroh. He apologizes for his mistakes, and Iroh is there to welcome him back with open arms. Iroh was never angry with Zuko. He was worried that it was a choice that Zuko was never going to find his way back from. Iroh always believed that Zuko was smart enough and passionate enough to move beyond what Ozai had expected him to be and follow his own path. And he did. And the path that Zuko chose led him back to his uncle, where these two fan-favorite characters embraced and shared one of the most beautiful and heart-wrenching scenes I've ever seen in a cartoon.